If Moshe's failure, or Moshe and Aaron's failure, was to not hold Hashem, so to speak, in reserve and say, no, Nisim from Hashem are for a special purpose, and they're not actually the solution all the time. And we really don't want to have this be the norm, but rather we wanted to have it be set aside for a separate, special purpose, a special separate use. That's how we want to treat Hashem's niflaot, Hashem's wonders. That if their mistake was not doing that, in a sense, they represent one extreme and a problematic extreme in what you might imagine as a possibility in Judaic leadership. You could imagine a leader who just says, look, it's all up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. All we need is to have emunah and perfect praxis in our keeping of his Torah, and everything will be fine, right? Like, you go to Jericho, the walls fall down, you get stuck next to the sea splits and you go through. Whatever it is throughout Jewish history, we can rely on Hashem. We don't need to do anything else. Obviously, to a certain degree, that's going to engender a danger of a certain kind of laziness, right? Because if you start believing that too much, then you start leaning very heavily on, all right, so if there are armies all around me closing in and they're going to threaten to chop us to pieces, we don't need swords and we don't need weapons and we don't need to fight. We can just raise our level of kashrut to another pinnacle, and Hashem will see what faith we have and what good shomrei mitzvot we are, and meteorites will fly from the sky and destroy all our enemies, right? There's a bit of fantasy that that's how the world works, but that's not really how the world works. That's not how HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants his people to live, right? He wants us to live in our land, and he wants our land to be a place where we don't depend every day on something seemingly miraculous happening because Moshe is right there with his mateh. Instead, he wants us to depend on rain, which is part of nature, right? It's part of the nature that Hashem created and that Hashem controls and that Hashem can speak to us through, but it's still a part of the fabric of a normal reality that we can relate to and even kind of be thoughtful about and solve problems in and figure things out. So the extreme of Moshe, it's maybe kind of obvious why that doesn't fit inside Eretz Yisrael, because I think sometimes we forget that it's not an accident that the miraculous survival of Bnei Yisrael in the desert was kind of a miserable time, right? That if HaKadosh Baruch Hu is sustaining you with his niflaot, it may be that you feel his closeness and you feel tremendous ability to trust in his might and his supremacy over nature, but he doesn't want you to get too comfortable with that, and so he kind of makes it a bit of a difficult situation, which certainly was the case in the Midbar. And he wants you to start thinking, like Bnei Yisrael do, that actually there's something better than this, which is living real life in the land he gave us, where our existence is not this kind of space capsule terror show with miraculous deliverance all the time, but instead is, not in the Apollo 13 situation, but more in like down on earth, doing things the way they're normally supposed to happen. Now, there's, of course, another extreme, the opposite extreme in terms of Judaic leadership that can be a problem and is really more often the problem that we have today, which is you can also have leaders who say, I don't live in some fantasy world up in heaven. I live here in the real world. And here in the real world, there's no one here to save us except ourselves. And so we need to be strong. We need to have an economy. We need to have alliances with foreign powers that worship other gods. We need to have fancy weaponry. And even with all of that, we can't take certain kinds of risks because there's only, one time that we get to lose, and then we've lost forever. And there's this failure to believe that at the end of the day, this is up to Hashem. There's this failure to recognize that we are Hashem's eternal people and that he ultimately cares about how we show him that we're willing to serve him according to his Torah, and that it's not this terrifying chess game against chaos where if you make one wrong move, then it's all over, which much more so is, let's say, how Bibi Netanyahu seems to view his role, right? That I think as much as one can attribute good intention to him wanting some notion of what's best for Bnei Israel, it's a what's best that does not see the hand of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the events of history. And so it's a what's best that says, look, if it could be the case that this country could be destroyed by a nuclear attack from Iran, then we should sacrifice everything and anything in order to prevent that. And that means maybe we should give up sovereignty here and there, and maybe we should kowtow to the Americans about this and that, and all these things that we need in order to prevent game over coming from Iran, right? Whereas a leader a bit more in the direction of Moshe would say, well, look, the point is not that Hashem says, don't rely on me and my niflaot ever. The point is that Hashem says, you should be makadish that. You should set it aside for a special purpose, right? And that is mostly going to mean that you're going to live in the real world, because he mostly wants you to go as far as you can, like David HaMelech, and say, Erdof oivayim wasigim, right? I will pursue my enemy and catch up to him, and be responsible for bringing about the result that you want. And then you go as far as you can in that direction, doing what you can and what you're capable of. But then when the point is you reach a certain impasse, and then you say, okay, the objective that serving Hashem has set for me is in that direction. I've come as far as I can go without wonders, and I have two choices now. I could go in a different direction away from what Hashem wants, and I could do that with my means that seem available and at my disposal, or I could forge ahead and try to go in the direction that I think Hashem wants, beyond the realm of what seems possible, and I can rely on him to make up the difference. And clearly, now, the bigger problem we often have in Medinat Yisrael in the present era is we have a dearth of leaders who are willing to operate that way, to say, look, it's our job to go as far as we can with the rational means, the scientific means, the material means, the normal everyday world means, those means that allow us to thrive and flourish in the land that Hashem gave us the way he wants, so that we're not living in some kind of terrifying, otherworldly stasis in the midbar. But once we do that, once we go that distance, and we haven't made it all the way there because we still haven't managed to figure out how to solve the puzzle that way with regard to a whole host of things, like settling the land and conquering it, or building a temple, or whatever else, we don't just say, okay, so give up on those things. Let's just form a better fortified city-state in Tel Aviv with a small, smart army and wait for the end of the universe and for the sun to burn out. Instead, what we're supposed to say is, no, Hashem made the world. The purpose of his making the world was for us to do some of these things. Right now, it seems like we can't do them without bringing the whole roof down on our heads, but we're going to try to do them anyway because there's no choice otherwise, right? There's no actual success in turning away from what Borei Olam wants you to do. So, on the one hand, Moshe was inappropriate as a leader for the land of Israel itself because he was, in a way, characteristic of his personality and his purpose. He was a bit deaf to what the people were really asking of him when they were saying, we want, sweet pomegranates and things. What they really wanted was to go to the land because they were fed up, not with trusting in Hashem, but they were fed up with the non-existence or the sort of bizarro existence of life in the Midbar, and they were ready for the reality that HaKadosh Baruch Hu actually wants his people to bring his presence into, with a temple and everything else that the Torah commands. So on the one hand, Moshe did make a mistake that showed his inappropriateness to lead the people into the land. And on the other hand, we need aspects of that, right? Yehoshua bin Nun was not the same thing as an alternative to Moshe, as Bibi Netanyahu, Yehoshua ben Nun was a lot like Moshe. He was Moshe's student, and he still relied on the walls of Jericho to fall down, and not, he wasn't cutting a deal with the king of Babylon or of Egypt to give him a bigger army to try to conquer Jericho, right? So we do need leaders who have that element of trust in Hashem, where they're willing to say, look, if the only way we can go further is by walking into the sea, then the sea will split for us, right? We need leaders who will say that, but we also, at the same time, need them to walk us to the sea with that rooted practical understanding that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to work as hard as we can to figure out every part of it that we can do for ourselves and do those things first before he has to step in.